Doesn't have a clip on it, so I'll put it in my pocket and see how it works. We'll figure it out later. It's good to see everybody out this morning. I appreciate so much your desire to study God's Word. I've got a lesson that is going to require us to move a little bit quickly this morning, but I wanted to kind of put several different stories and compile some thoughts together thinking about faith. And there's a lot of different ways to study faith and to think about faith. Obviously, one of the passages I'm starting with here, Hebrews 11:6, is one of kind of our foundation points where he tells us without faith it's impossible to please God. And this is, if something is essential to pleasing God, then we need to understand it. We need to take time and think about it. It's a huge part of the Bible story, a huge part of what God asks from us. And when you connect it with this idea from Hebrews 11 that without faith it's impossible to please Him, I think what you realize is God has designed the world. He has created us and is looking for people to welcome into eternity with Him. And He's designed things so that faith is the litmus test. Faith is the thing that He's looking for. He's looking for people who can walk by faith. And you see that throughout Hebrews 11. That's the theme of that chapter is men and women who stood up and lived their faith. Abraham is in that chapter, and we're going to reference his story a few times through this lesson. And the other verse that I wanted to connect here in the beginning is Genesis 22 and verse 1. If you're familiar with Genesis 22, that's the story that is where God commands Abraham to go and sacrifice his son. Go and sacrifice your son Isaac. But the story begins with verse 1 where he tells us God tested Abraham. God tested Abraham. And this is one of those things that is very interesting. It's very challenging to think about. We know from James chapter 1 that God doesn't tempt anyone. We understand God doesn't tempt us. Temptations come from ourselves. Temptations come from within. But from this passage, and I think many, many other places, we realize that God does test us. God does test our faith. And again, God tests Abraham, and without faith it's impossible to please Him. What we realize is that God is testing the faith of Abraham. We know as he goes through this story and shows his willingness to sacrifice Isaac. Obviously, the angel stops him, holds him back. But we know from Hebrews 11 that by faith he was willing to do that. By faith he was willing to do that. And so we understand that God was testing his faith, and he passed the test. He passed the test, showed that he was willing to act in faith and to follow through with what was asked of him. And what I would like to present this morning is what I think is a reality, that God is testing all of our faiths. He is testing all of our faiths every day. I think that's what life is all about. Life is all about us, our faith being tested by God. He doesn't tempt us, so let's understand that. But He is putting tests in front of us daily to see whether we're going to walk by faith or not. Without faith, it's impossible to please Him. So we've got to learn how to walk by faith. He's asking us to learn how to walk by faith. And so I want to kind of frame at least one way to think about how our faith is tested. Our faith is tested in so many different ways. And I think primarily you can kind of frame it in the way that I'm going to be trying to frame it is different ways that our faith is tested when God's commands require us to do things that challenge us. I'm going to frame different ways that I think our faith is tested. And basically what we're going to be making the point as we go along is by faith, we either obey or we don't. By faith, we either obey or we don't. Our faith is tested constantly every day. And whether or not we pass the test depends on whether or not we obeyed or not. So we're going to go through and kind of make these connections in some ways very obvious, I think, but also I hope very profitable as well. So our faith is tested when what is commanded, what he is asking from us, appears to be wrong. Sometimes through our own vantage point, through our own by our own perspective, we look at the commands of God, we look at what he's asking of us, and it appears to be wrong. It appears to be something that we should not do. One example of that would be a verse I quoted in class this morning where we're told, if a man will not work, neither let him eat. Now that's a command. If a man will not work, neither let him eat. And some people look at that and say, well, that's wrong. That can't be right. Well, when you understand the principle behind that, then you can see why it is right, why it is the right thing to do. But that's one of these things that sometimes, depending on our perspective, we can read God's commands and they can appear to be wrong. The example that I started with, I want to run with just for a second. Can you imagine being Abraham and being asked to offer up your son, Isaac? Obviously, so a few points need to be made off of this, but I don't believe Abraham lived under a different dispensation. God was speaking directly to the fathers at that time. I don't believe we're sitting around waiting for an angel to give us instruction. And we're certainly, we're told under the new covenant, even if an angel comes and tells us to do anything other than what the gospel has already told us, then that angel needs to be accursed, or the apostle needs to be accursed if he's teaching us anything other than this. So we can understand that, but just imagine for a second that you're Abraham back in that time, and God, you've been walking by faith. You've been walking by faith. He left his homeland by faith. He sojourned in a land by faith. He had done many things, and now God is asking. By faith, he had waited for the Son of Promise, and now God is asking him to sacrifice the Son of Promise. That must have sounded so wrong to Abraham. That must have sounded so wrong to him. How can God ask me to do this? How can God ask me to sacrifice my son? We know several things when you look at Hebrews retelling of that in Hebrews 11. He tells us another level of Abraham's understanding. He says Abraham believed, he had faith that God could even bring Isaac back from the dead. He could bring him, he could resurrect him. And Abraham, having never known of Jesus' resurrection or anyone else's resurrection, had the faith that God could do that, which is an amazing thing. But just the fact that he was willing to follow through, he was willing to go right up to the point where he had the knife raised and he was ready to plunge that into Isaac, despite the fact that it must have seemed like the complete wrong thing to do. He was willing to do that, is an amazing statement to me. In James chapter 2, when James is talking about Abraham's faith, specifically talking about Abraham's faith, this story, and he says Abraham's faith was perfected by his works. So if you connect Genesis 22 verse 1, God tested Abraham by asking him to do this. And then we see Abraham following through up to the point where he was ready to kill his son as God had instructed. We see his faith was perfected by those works. His faith was perfected by following through. And we're going to see this. I think you see this with all of the examples of people who walked in faith, people who stood up for their faith. Their faith was perfected by their obedience. Their faith was perfected by the fact that they were willing to trust. And in this example, Abraham trusted despite the fact that he could not have possibly understood why this was what God wanted. There was no way Abraham could have thought through. It's like, oh, okay. So thousands of years from now, God's going to come in the flesh, and God, the Son of God, Jesus, will die on the cross for people's sins. And this is a shadow of what God has planned. There's no way he could have figured all that out. It couldn't have even started to figure out. He just needed to have faith. And he did. His faith was perfected by his obedience. Another example, and we could go on and on. I've just got a couple of examples for each of the points. And again, trying to move quickly. I'll try to move quicker after this point. But In Acts chapter 10, Peter is told to go and preach the gospel to the Gentiles. And he didn't understand how that could be what God wanted. That he thought that was wrong. Remember, he's receiving this heavenly vision telling him to kill and eat these unclean animals, and he's resisting because he does not think that's right. And God reconfirms the message over and over again. And after Peter finally gets the point and he goes to Cornelius' house, remember his realization. He realizes that God is no respecter of persons. His eyes have been opened. So what appeared to be wrong to him, he didn't understand how God could be asking him to do this, but he follows through. He follows through. He gets up and he obeys, and then his eyes are opened in the middle of that to realize why this is what God wanted. And I feel like that's a good example for us. Again, we're following the New Testament. We're not waiting for angels to reveal anything to us. We have the confirmed word. But oftentimes when we read the word and we read what God is asking us, for example, those who have been in the Sermon on the Mount class that we've been going through, we just read today about how we're supposed to turn the other cheek. And we're supposed to give to the one who asks us. And we're supposed to love our enemies. And sometimes we read things like that and we just don't understand. How can that be what God wants me to be? How can that be what God wants me to do? But we need to do it in faith. We need to do it in faith. We need to figure out how to live that way in faith, obey in faith. And if we'll do that, I think oftentimes, it may take years and months and years, but oftentimes our eyes will be open, as Peter's were in this story, and we'll realize, now I see. Now I know why God wanted me to do that. Now I understand why this was the right thing to do. But our faith is tested when we don't understand. Our faith is tested when it appears to be the wrong thing, and we still have to do it. We still need to obey the Lord. Going right along with that is sometimes our faith is tested when what has been commanded seems contrary to reason. And I think the examples I've just been given of turning the other cheek and going the extra mile would certainly fall into that category as well. It's like, that doesn't make sense. How can God want me to do that? That doesn't make sense. It's contrary to what we think would be the right thing to do, the reasonable thing to do. I thought about Noah and being instructed to build the ark. He hadn't seen rain, didn't know what rain was, certainly hadn't seen a worldwide flood. And yet God tells him it's coming. It's coming, and I want you to build this massive ark, this massive boat. And by the way, it's going to take you 100 years to do this, and I want you to do it by these dimensions, and I want you to do it with this wood, and I want you to put this on the outside of it. None of that would have seemed reasonable to Noah. None of that would have, if he sat down like, why am I doing this? The only reason he's doing it is because God told him to do it. God commanded him to do it. And just like with Abraham, we see no indication from Noah's story, just like we didn't see any indication from Abraham's story in Genesis 22 of them questioning or wondering like, why are we doing this way? Why these dimensions? Why this and why that? Noah, we're told, I believe 3 times in that text, Noah did all that was commanded of him. Noah did all that was commanded of him. And when we pick up with that story in Hebrews 11, it doesn't speak of obedience. It uses the word faith. By faith, Noah built the ark. And this is the connection I really want you to take with you today. I want us to take with us home is obedience and faith go hand in hand. If you really obey God, your faith is tested when you read God's laws and you see this is what God wants from me, this is the kind of life I'm supposed to live, and whether it seems right to you or not, whether it seems contrary to reason or not, your faith is tested, and He's asking you, are you going to obey or not? Are you going to do what I've asked or not? Noah passed the test in an amazing way. A much simpler example of Moses, and we could do several things from the life of Moses, but this particular story is when God is first appearing to Moses in the burning bush, and Moses asks the question, it's like, well, what do I do if they won't listen to me? He's in the middle of making his excuses. Well, what do I do if they don't listen? And God tells him to throw his staff down. Remember, throw your staff down, and what happens? It becomes a serpent. So what God has shown him is power. He's like, my power will be with you. And what does Moses do when he sees the serpent? He runs. He runs away from like, that's natural, right? So what does God tell him to do? Grab it up by the tail. Grab it up by the tail. That seems wrong and contrary to reason. Why are we grabbing the snake by the tail? Why? Why does God want him to grab it by the tail? It would take faith to do that, right? You do not grab a snake by the tail unless God is telling you to and you have faith. And that's very powerful to me. That there are times in our lives where God's commands are just not going to make sense to us. And it's going to seem like the right thing to do is to just set this command aside for a minute and do what I think is right. And God says, no, I want you to grab the snake by the tail. Have faith. There's a lot of different examples of this, and I'd like you to turn to 1 Corinthians, because I think this is a principle we can take with us through the rest of the lesson. 1 Corinthians 1 and 2, but this passage came up. Jeff and I were having a religious discussion earlier this week, or I guess last week, and this passage came up. It's a great passage to spend some time with, but just for a second, skim a few verses with me. 1 Corinthians 1 and verse 18 says, the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing. It makes no sense. But to we who are being saved, it is the power of God. You see this contrasted to the people who can walk by faith, to the people who will accept what God is telling them. It is the power of God. But to some who are perishing, it appears to be folly. He says, it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For in the wisdom of God, the world did not know God through wisdom. It pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For the Jews demand a sign. So you have this one group, the Jews, demanding a sign. We want you to show us why we should believe this. The Greeks seek wisdom. They want somebody to explain it to them. Paul says, we preach Christ crucified. We're preaching this message, this gospel. It's a stumbling block to the Jews and it's folly to the Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. The gospel message, the commands of God are wisdom. They are righteousness. They are the power of God unto salvation. But to those who don't get it, those who don't want to get it, it appears wrong. It appears to be foolishness. They just don't understand. And you can read into that context some down into chapter 2, verse 5. Paul says the whole point of his preaching, was so that their faith, and this is the word we're running with this morning, so their faith would not rest in the wisdom of men, but in the power of God. Like the whole point of my preaching was to make sure that you were listening to God, listening to the wisdom of God, whether it made sense to you or not. Because that's the test of your faith, is if you're going to hear the wisdom of God and believe it and accept it or not. That's going to connect with several points as we move along. I also continue to make these types of points. Our faith is tested when what is commanded does not seem to connect with our goal. It doesn't seem to connect with where we're going, what we want to accomplish. And I think a couple of examples. Remember Israel at Jericho. What was Israel's goal crossing the Jordan River? What was their goal? Conquer the promised land. God's going to give us the promised land. God is going to give us the promised land. So they come up to Jericho, and what do they find? They find a mighty walled city, and the text says it was shut up tight. It was shut up tight, mighty walls. Terry showed us some pictures of the excavation of Jericho. Thick walls. These were not the kind of walls I would build. These are thick walls. And the city is shut up tight. And you could see them coming up here saying, God's going to give us this city. Why are the walls still here? Why is the city shut up tight? And God says, don't worry, I've got a plan. I want you to be really quiet for 7 days. And then I want you to walk around. I want you in the right order with the ark and the priest. And I want everybody to walk around one time a day for 6 days. Then, after you've been quiet that whole time, on the 7th day, I want you to march around 7 times. and then you can shout, and then you can blow the trumpets, and then the walls will fall down. And I could just imagine those people saying, why does that help us? Like, we're trying to conquer this place, and you want us to be quiet, and you want us to walk around, and we're going to blow our trumpets. Why does this make any sense? This doesn't connect with what I'm trying to accomplish. Don't we judge things that way sometimes? We're wanting to do this, we're wanting to do that, and these are good goals, these are good things, sometimes even goals that we have for the kingdom, and yet the means to get there sometimes just doesn't make sense to us. He tells them to walk around 7 times. When Hebrews speaks of this in Hebrews 11, he says, the walls of Jericho fell down by faith. The walls of Jericho did not fall down because the people were really, really quiet. The walls of Jericho did not fall because they marched around them 13 times. The walls of Jericho fell down because by faith they did everything that was asked of them. By faith they obeyed it, even though it did not connect with any kind of reason or a goal that they could have seen. They obeyed. I would ask you to turn to John 9. We're going to look at a couple of passages here in John. The first one here, John 9. This one is an interesting example of Jesus asking somebody to do something that makes no sense whatsoever if you're looking at things through the eye of the world, through worldly wisdom. John 9, the story of the man born blind, very powerful miracle. Jesus begins, or the story begins by the people asking him, the disciples, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind. So he's addressing that misunderstanding of why this man was born blind. And Jesus says, no, it was so that the works of God could be displayed in him. I'm going to use this as a way to illustrate the power that I have. He says in verse 5, as long as I'm in the world, I am a light of the world. I'm the light of the world. In the whole chapter, I think you can see that's really the theme that he picks up in the back end of the chapter, teaching that lesson over and over again. But as they're standing here in the presence of this blind man, and I'm thinking it makes sense to think that the blind man would have been hearing this. He would have been hearing this discussion and probably had heard people ask before, like, why was he born blind? Did he sin? Did his parents sin? Whose fault is this? He'd probably heard discussions like that before. And then he hears this man say, I am the light of the world. And then he spits on the ground. He spits on the ground, and he makes mud, and he anoints the man's eyes with mud. So I want you to think about, you're the blind man. You heard this discussion, and this guy puts mud on your eyes. Like, what are we doing? How does this make any sense at all? And then the man tells him, go and wash in the pool of Siloam. Like, number one, why'd you put the mud on my eyes? Number two, you put it on, you wash it off. You bring me some water. Why must I go to that pool, get one of your disciples to bring me some water? He doesn't say any of that. Apparently he does exactly what has been asked of him. He goes and he washed, and the scripture says, the Bible is constantly understating things. He goes and he washes it, and he comes back seeing. He comes back seeing. He obeyed. By faith, he did what was asked of him, and he comes back seeing. That's just a beautiful point, and he takes the lesson from that. He understands. The rest of this chapter is about how other people missed the point, but he understood the point that Jesus was sent from God. He could do nothing if he wasn't sent from God, but his faith was tested by being asked to do something that really made no sense at all, and certainly, washing mud off your eyes. When has that ever healed a blind man? But in this case, because Jesus asked him to, it does. Our faith is tested when what is commanded is contrary to our personal preference. Here in John chapter 12, just a couple chapters over, we read more about the religious rulers that they'd missed the point of the John 9 miracle. They'd missed the point of a lot of what Jesus was doing. And we understand a little bit about why down in the end of chapter 12, verse 42. John 12, verse 42 says, nevertheless, many of the authorities believed in him. So they believed in him, but for fear of the Pharisees, they did not confess, so that they would not be put out of the synagogue, for they loved the glory that comes from men more than the glory that comes from God. So they had a big problem here. They wanted the glory that comes from men. more than they cared about being pleasing to God. Their faith was tested. They believed, but their belief did not pass the test. Their belief did not pass the test. Remember from James chapter 2, Abraham's faith was perfected by obedience. And in that text, if you go and read James 2, he tells us even the demons believe in God, but their faith is not perfected by obedience. Abraham's faith was perfected by obedience. These people's faith is just like the demons. Just like the demons. They believed, but for fear of the Jews, they wouldn't do anything about it. Their faith was not perfected by their obedience because they loved the glory that comes from men more. You remember the story of Naaman. Naaman the leper finds out about the prophet in Israel who could heal a leprosy. And he goes there, and the prophet won't even come out of his house. Won't even come out of the house. He sends the message by the servant, tells this mighty man, a Syrian warrior, tells him, go and dip 7 times in the Jordan River. Go and dip 7 times. And Naaman did not want to hear that. You remember Naaman's reaction? He goes away in a rage. He's angry about it. He's like, oh, we've got prettier rivers back in my home country. Why would I go to this dirty river? Why does the prophet not come out and say something? Why doesn't he wave his hands over me and do some wondrous thing in order to heal me? And it takes his servant, Naaman's servant, has to talk him down and tell him, you know, this is an amazing thing. This is a great word that the prophet has spoken to you. If you do this, his servant tells him, this is a great word. If you go and dip 7 times, you're going to be clean. Why not do that? He basically tells him, why not do that? And when Naaman does, even though it was contrary to his personal preference, once he does it, he is clean. Our faith is often tested when what is being asked is not what we want to do. And with this point, I'd like to connect that with the command to be baptized. I think some people in the religious world, they don't understand. They don't understand, how this connects with their goal of being saved. It seems contrary to reason. Why should I be baptized? And definitely contrary to their personal preferences I'm just going to ask Jesus into my heart. I'm going to let him save me that way, which I have decided. But that's not what Jesus asked for. That's not what his followers asked for. You go and read in Acts chapter 2, when the people of that time were pricked in their heart, and they said, what must we do? What must we do? And Peter tells them, you need to repent. You need to be baptized. If they had heard that and believed, but not done anything, their faith would not have been perfected. Their faith was perfected when they heard that, and 3,000 of them obeyed. 3,000 of them obeyed, despite whether or not that was their preference or not. 3,000 obeyed, and they were saved. They were added to the church. This is one of those where I put Romans 6 on here because I think the more you understand what Romans 6 is teaching, the more you'll understand why baptism does make sense. Baptism is a picture of when we die with Christ and we're raised to walk a new life. And it's a beautiful picture that God has given us. And so it might seem contrary to our goal. It may seem contrary to reason. It may not be our preference, but it is what God asked for. And the more you understand about it, it starts to make sense. But it doesn't have to make sense for us to obey. That's really my point. It doesn't have to make sense for us to obey. Our faith is tested when we're asked to do something that doesn't make sense to us and doesn't connect with our personal preference. I'll move quickly through the last few. Our faith is tested, I think, often when what has been commanded of us could endanger our personal safety. If I follow this command, I could be kicked out of society. If I follow this command, if I live my life this way, I could lose my job. If I lose my life or live my life this way, I could be persecuted. I could lose my life. Think about Daniel. We won't turn to some of these passages, but Daniel and his friends were amazing examples. Young men who had been removed from their families and yet were standing for their faith. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego powerfully told King Nebuchadnezzar, says, we have no need to answer you about this. We're not going to worship your gods. We're not going to worship your gods. And because of that, they weren't just almost thrown in the fiery furnace or threatened with the fiery furnace. They were thrown into the fiery furnace. They stood for their faith despite the danger to their personal safety. Daniel in the lion's den is the exact same picture, where he knew that prayer had been outlawed and he didn't care. He was going to keep praying as he always had done. That's a beautiful picture for us. And I've known people who claim to be Christians who will argue that they can set aside God's commands at times in order to protect their safety, in order to protect their person. And I don't think that's what God is teaching. I think what he's asking us to do is stand up and do what's right, regardless of the cost. There's a great story, again, moving a little quicker here, but the widow of Zarephath, you remember her story? It was just her and her son. It was just her and her son, and the prophet shows up, Elijah shows up, and he tells her, make him some bread. Make me some bread. And she says, look, I was about to go cook a little bit of something for me and my boy, and that's all we've got, and then we're just going to go starve because there's nothing else for us to do. This is all we've got left. And Elijah tells her, first make bread for me, and then make bread for you and your son. And if you think about like what she's already told him and then what he's asking, he's basically asking her to give him the last thing that she knows she has and take it on faith that something else will be provided. And she does. She goes and she bakes this bread for him and gives it to him. The last thing she knew she would be able to do, and she gives it to him. And that's the oil that doesn't run out. That's the oil that keeps giving. She's able, through the whole famine, she is provided for because she had faith, because she acted on faith in what the prophet was telling her. It's a powerful story. And again, a beautiful picture for us that we need to be trying to do the right thing regardless of the cost. The apostles are great examples of this. They were threatened. They were beaten. They were commanded not to speak anymore in the name of Christ. And they said, you be the judge. Is it better for me to obey God or to obey you? What's more important? And they say, as for us, we cannot stop speaking what we have seen and heard. We're not going to stop for a second. Just a few years later, after this statement, persecution begins. People start losing their lives. Stephen loses his life. One of the apostles loses his life. His head is removed. We read in secular history that all of the apostles died violent deaths except for John. So these Christians were putting their money where their mouth was. They were putting their lives on the line for standing up for the truth. They were living their faith despite the danger to their personal safety. Many of them also were standing up against the religion of their family. I put Gideon on here. I'll come back to him. But remember, as we're talking about the first century, Paul and so many others, by standing up for their faith, by standing up for the gospel, they were removed from society. They were kicked out of the synagogues. They were not able to live in normal, polite society as they had been. They were being asked to separate from their families. Philippians 3, where Paul is talking about this, he says, I counted all things as loss for Christ. I counted everything as loss for Christ. Everything that meant something to me, my education, my family, my upbringing, I counted all of that as loss so that I could gain Christ. That's the kind of faith he had. His faith was tested, and he passed the test. Gideon was an interesting example, I thought, because we see him being commanded to tear down his father's idols. And he does it, but remember, he does it at night. He goes by night to do it. He follows the command, but he was a little bit unsure of himself. And it took a while for Gideon to become the mighty man of valor that God called him to be. But still, he was willing to take those first steps. And I think that's a good picture for us. Going right along with Paul's example and the early Christians' example as well, they were willing to stand up for their faith even when it was costing them financial gain, costing them jobs, costing them property. Hebrews 10:34 describes the fact that Christians at times had their property seized because they were standing up for their faith. And it says there in Hebrews 10:34 that they accepted it joyfully. They accepted it joyfully. They were fulfilling Christ's words. Count it all joy when you are persecuted. Count it all joy when you encounter these things for me. 1 Peter speaks about that as well. I would like to conclude by getting you to turn to 1 John. 1 John chapter 5. This is a passage that is very powerful, and it does connect the thoughts that we've been developing but it's more often known or quoted as just thinking about the victory that we have. And so let's start with that in verse 4. Verse 4 of 1 John 5, it says, everyone who has been born of God overcomes the world, and this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. And a lot of times we quote that, we think about that. It's a wonderful promise, and I don't want to take away from that. Our victory that has overcome the world is faith. That is exactly true. Without faith, we can't please God. By faith, we overcome the world. That is exactly true. But it has to be a faith that is perfected by obedience. It has to be a faith that has passed the test. Have you obeyed the Lord even when it didn't make sense to you, even when you couldn't understand why, even when it cost you things? In this text, go back up to verse 1. Everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ has been born of God, and everyone who loves the Father loves whoever has been born of him. By this we know that we love the children of God, when we love God and obey his commands. Verse 3, this is the love of God, that we keep his commands, and his commandments are not burdensome. What he's doing here, by the time you get to verse 4, and he says, everyone who has been born of God overcomes the world, and that is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. That is not without definition. The definition for the victory, the faith that overcomes the world, is the one who is born of God. If you go back and you look in those verses, the one who is born of God is the one who keeps his commandments. These things are connected. You are not born of God unless you're keeping his commandments. You're not born of God unless you're standing in faith and living the way he's asked you to live. People, they want to claim that they're children of God. They want to claim the victory that faith offers, but they're not willing to stand up and pass these kinds of tests. They're not willing to make sacrifices for their faith. They're not willing to go out on a limb for their faith. Everyone who is born of God, he says, keeps his commandments. You have to keep his commandments or you're not born of God. You can also add to that verse 5. Who is it that overcomes the world except the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God? And again, if you take that verse in a vacuum, you may say, oh, well, all I have to do is believe. I'm just going to believe like those demons who are trembling. I'm going to believe like them and I'll overcome the world. It can't be that kind of belief. It has to be the kind of belief that is perfected by obedience, that is perfected, as James says, by works. And we know works don't save us. Don't leave here this morning saying, Sam said works save us. I've got to do enough works to save myself. No, faith saves us. Faith is perfected by works. And your faith is tested every day. Your faith is tested every day by whether or not you're going to live his commandments or not. I appreciate so much your attention. I hope these things have been profitable to consider. I'll leave the lesson with you as we sing the song of invitation. Let's all take a look at our lives. Think about what God has called us to do, how he's called us to live. Those who have been in our Sermon on the Mount study, you could know, hey, go read chapter 5 and chapter 6 of Matthew, and you can see what God is asking from us. You can see what he's requiring of us. He's asking us to live different from the world. He's asking us to be lights and salt. He's asking us to stand out in a world of darkness. If you know for whatever reason that you've not been living that way, that you've been compromising your principles, if you're sitting here today and you know that your faith has failed the test in some way, you need to make it right. And maybe that means coming forward, confessing sin, letting your brethren know what you've been dealing with. Whatever the case may be, I'd ask you, let's make it right this morning as we stand and sing.